Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. This is the third session in a three-part series on inclusive and accessible teaching experiences. So thank you for being here today. Today is the final session, and today's session is practical steps for inclusive teaching. I'll be one of the presenters. I'm Terry Horton. I'm one of the Learning and Teaching with Technology consultants for LSA. And I'll be joined by Phil Deaton. Phil is the University of Michigan Digital Information Accessibility Coordinator. Just some housekeeping before we get started. We have moderators with us today. We have Siba El Dalal and Sean Jackson, who are fellow consultants in LSA with me. They're going to be managing the question and answer tool. So if you do have any questions throughout the session, feel free to place those in the Q&A, and then we'll stop about midway. And Sean and Siba can, ask us those questions that you have. At the end of the session, we will open it up and let you unmute if you'd like to ask questions in person. You'll be able to do that. We are recording the session, so at the end, once the video is done processing, I'll be sending you an email with a link to the video. You might find that helpful. I'll also send our slides and a few handouts that we have. And then I do want to point out that there are closed captions available. If you look at the bottom of your screen where it says live transcript, if you click on that, you'll have some viewing options, and you might choose to not see those, but that's available to you. So let's get to it. I think a good place to start is by defining what we mean by inclusive teaching, because it is a broadly defined topic. It's at least for the purpose of today's session, what we mean by it is really more of an approach to teaching in which you think about creating a learning environment that everyone can learn in. So it's explicit, it's deliberate, but it's really not a prescriptive approach. There's no formula. There's no formula that makes it work. It's about being open and reflective and just really thinking about, are you creating that environment that includes all students? So today we just really want you to think about that, evaluate your own teaching practices. And I think for me, a good way to think about it is asking, who's being excluded? Are your teaching practices excluding anybody? And so we may ask you to think about that a few times throughout today's session. The objectives today, then we have four main topics that we want to talk about, really practical approaches here. First, some practical approaches to getting to know your students as individuals, approaches to creating inclusive course content, that material that you bring into the course. And then we'll talk about some ways to give students more opportunities to demonstrate their understanding, different approaches to assessment, and then get you thinking about the student engagement techniques that you're using in your class, the activities that students do every day in your class, and whether or not those are inclusive and how you might do better in that way. So to get started, Phil's going to talk about why it's important to get to know your students as individuals.
Thank you, Terry. I think that one thing that Terry mentioned earlier is that inclusive teaching really starts with inclusive and open interactions. And I think that for an instructor or for an instructional designer, that starts with respecting students' identities and their experiences. And I think an important way to do that is to start by really learning students' names, preferred names, and pronouns. We've included some links here for how individuals can change their gender identity in Wolverine Access and in Canvas. And including information about this potentially on your syllabus or in other areas in your first day discussion is a really great way to let students know that you're here to respect them as they are, and that you will do your best to respect those pronouns and those names. I think that another important practice is to help students get to know each other. So encourage sharing, encourage the classroom as potentially a place of community. I don't think that there's always a classroom is always going to mean the same thing to every student, but for some students, it could be a really important space of community and a place of growth. And really honing in on that growth mindset in your early lectures, I think is a really important thing. We even see a lot of companies like Microsoft and others really targeting growth mindset as a way to learn as we develop. One thing that you may want to consider is trying to stay up to date on kind of what's happening around us. At this time, we're obviously in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, and there are a lot of injustices happening in the United States and around the world. And being able to kind of keep up with those things can be important because these events can impact students with different identities. It can be challenging to keep up with those things, but I think it can be very important as well. Sharing a bit about yourself as a person is a very good way to get others to open up. So talking about your experiences, how your identities have shaped you as an individual and what you've been learning, what you like to do. All of these things can really make the classroom into more of that communal space for some students. And I think that that's a really great thing to do. And
So the next thing to think about is thinking about your students as individual learners. While we know they come with a variety of backgrounds, and I think we know that we're going to have a variety of students in our class, really think about the actual individual students that are in your class. And one of the things you can do is assess their prior knowledge. What do they already know about the topic? Have you assessed that? And what do they need to know to be successful? If you can help identify those deficits, let's say, for lack of a better word, in your students, and help them self-identify those areas where they need help, that's going to help them feel included in the class. I mean, I think we've all been in a classroom where we felt like we don't belong because we're not up to date on the material. So I'll give you an example. I was working with a professor who taught African history. And he came to us because he was very frustrated because students, he said, don't have the foundational knowledge in geography and geopolitics. And he said, it makes it impossible to teach this class because I need them to know these things, but I can't spend the class teaching them. So we talked about, first of all, how does he assess where they're at and help them self-assess? And one of the things that he used was iClicker Cloud. If you're not familiar with that, iClicker Cloud is a polling tool, but it also has a feature where you can put a map on the board and then students can pinpoint a location that lets them know like how they're doing with geography, multiple choice questions that can help students understand, how much they understand geopolitics. But it was a great way for him to kind of determine where the class was and to help students see, wow, I need to understand this foundational knowledge of geography or I'm going to have a hard time being successful in the class. So once he understood that, then he was able to give them some more content that maybe not all of the students used. You have supplemental material like extra quizzes, and he found some apps on the phone, some geography apps that were really helpful for students to have on hand as they were going through the lecture. They could be looking at the app and locating certain areas on the map. And it was just a way for students to first identify the need that they had, but instead of having them feel like they were all alone, giving them that supplemental material. So assess your students' prior knowledge and see if you can help in that way too. And then scaffolding the work to encourage goal setting. Now, I know sometimes it seems like you want them to do that themselves, but remember, students are novices, not just in the content area, but they're novice learners too. They need help learning how to do this. So if you can chunk the coursework and you can break it into pieces, it's really going to help them understand process. And for example, many students maybe don't have experience with writing process, and they may not know that good writers have a process. They might have an outline, a draft, a revision. Help them set those goals for themselves to see that because they are learning, and that keeps students from falling behind. clear deadlines for certain components of the assignment to help them with time management. Again, I know we often think of college students should be able to set their own goals, but so often they don't have those skills. And this just keeps everyone on the same page. Pay attention when they can't meet their deadlines. It's easy to assume that, well, maybe they're lazy or they're just not paying attention or staying on task, but sometimes there's a reason. And it might apply to the whole class, but you can ask students, where are you getting stuck? Where are the bottlenecks in your progress? For example, a student may really struggle with research and maybe not have a lot of experience with libraries because it can be overwhelming navigating a library. Maybe that's where they're stuck. And if that's the case, then you can give them some more resources and adjust your expectations for some students. It's a different way of thinking. I know years ago, when I first started teaching, I was really strict about those timelines. Everything's due 11:59 on Sunday. But maybe rethink that. Does it have to be? What if somebody is working and they just need some more assistance? Can you extend the timeline? And pay attention to maybe you haven't been giving students enough time. So adjust those expectations for students.
I think an important part of inclusive teaching, as Terry is mentioning, is really being upfront about those expectations. So there's a lot of ways you can do this. Really providing multiple modes of engaging with like the course calendar and due dates. So a visual course calendar could be helpful. As Sean discussed in our last session, providing rubrics or assignment sheets is a really great way to let students know what your expectations are before they go into assignments. Providing timely feedback is really important as well. I know I think it was my second year teaching, I had a first year student, and the first few weeks of the class were very stressed out about receiving feedback to make sure that what they were doing was meeting my expectations. And sometimes you need to get to grading quicker than may seem possible. And if you're making changes mid-semester, just letting students know about that, being responsive to student feedback. Disabilities may change students' needs. And if you're making changes mid-semester, then, this could change students' needs further. And also being able to use different prompts for in-class activities like time prompts and asking students for feedback after you use those, because sometimes we don't give enough time, sometimes it's too much time. I think that's always helpful.
So to think about inclusive materials, the first workshop that we did really got into some of the nitty-gritty of creating documents that are accessible, using accessibility checker, those type of really specific things. So I just would refer you back to that first session that we did. And when we follow up, we're going to give you a link to the webpage that'll have each of these sessions. So do go back and review that for that type of detail. But the first addition to make your course more inclusive that I'd like to talk about is video recordings. And this is kind of a non-traditional approach. I know we're getting really familiar with making recordings now, right? And so many of you have found Kaltura is actually pretty easy to use, and you can create your own videos as a supplement. So I really want to encourage that because it is non-traditional, but many students think how many students learn from watching videos. I learned from watching videos. They can be, tremendously helpful. So I want to encourage you to start creating what we call just-in-time videos for really important course content. Just-in-time videos, that's a term that means they're videos that are available to students when they need them and how they need them. So first of all, think about using these for really challenging course content. You might be teaching a difficult concept, let's say the principles of cost and benefits in an econ class. And you know that you've taught the class for 4 semesters, you know that every time you get to this topic, students just don't seem to understand it. The traditional lecture and the documents that you give them just aren't working for some students. create a video around this where maybe you tell a little story, you give a scenario that talks about the principle of cost and benefits, explains it in a different way. Maybe not everybody will need that, but it will reach certain students that just need that little bit of help. So think about that as you're planning maybe for winter semester. What are those topics that you just know they're going to struggle with? Because you know what those are. And then what about topics that they're actively struggling with, like at the moment? Maybe you didn't anticipate that. Think about using video um, and post it on your announcement. So maybe you did some assessment, you had a quiz in class, or they did some type of assignment, and you can see there's really a misconception about the material, or they're just not understanding. Go ahead and create a video, just talking to students. Hey students, after looking at your quizzes, I can see that you're all really struggling with this. Let me explain it in a different way. Take that different approach instead of just saying again what you just said in lecture. Try a different approach and try to use video, because I think that a lot of students today really respond to video. And then I want to really encourage you to use the lecture capture or record in Zoom. Now, I've had a lot of questions about this, in particular recording in Zoom, where faculty are worried about posting recordings. One of the things they're worried about is that what if I make a mistake and then it's there forever? Or what if students say something they don't really want recorded? What if we're having some kind of interaction, student to teacher interaction, and I don't want that captured? Then I'd say that the thing that I would encourage you to do is think about the content that you're going to be delivering. Maybe you call it a lecture, maybe not, but at times you're going to have to talk to your students. You're going to have to synthesize material. You want to talk directly to them, and maybe chunk that together so that the first 15 minutes of class you're going to record, and this is the content, and these are the difficult topics you want to talk about. This is not you interacting with the rest of the class. And just be strategic about chunking that together, record that, and then publish that for students. And I do encourage you to publish the lecture capture if you're using lecture capture in the classroom. And I also want you to think about the document camera, probably the least used technical tool we have in the classrooms. Very few people use the document camera, but it is really helpful for not just students who might have a disability, but for other students. We're finding that they prefer to see writing on the document camera as opposed to the blackboard. It can be more clear, and it certainly translates over video much better, whether you're in face-to-face or hybrid. If you do happen to be teaching remotely completely and you do think you could use a document camera, we can help you with that. We have spaces where you can just come in and record. We actually have been loaning out document cameras for people to use at home too. What we're finding from faculty who do publish their recordings is that students are viewing the recordings in strategic places, meaning, they're scrolling through, they're finding a particular area that, is an area they need to review. They're not watching the whole video, unless maybe they weren't in class, but they're going to those areas where they just they need to hear it one more time. They need to practice a little bit more. They're using them to study and to review for exams, and we'll see an uptick in students going into the lecture capture, watching the videos at that time. And then, of course, if a student can't make it to class. So right now, we need to be especially aware that there are students who, for a variety of reasons, aren't going to be able to come to class. If we can make that available to them. I do have this image that I want to show you. This is actually a video. So this is from our lecture capture system. And this is a chemistry professor who moved from writing on the blackboard in the lecture hall to using the document camera. And so this is a view. Students can select their view. This happens to be a split view. So you can see the professor talking, and then you can see the document camera. You could have just the image on the dock camera take up the whole screen, but you can see how much more clear this is for students. They're never going to be able to read the blackboard in watching lecture capture. They might be able to see it in the classroom, but it's so much more clear. This professor actually surveyed hundreds and hundreds of students, and overwhelmingly they preferred the document camera in class because they can see it up here in the classroom, but also to review. And with the lecture capture system, they can scroll through like thumbnails and they can go right to the spot they need. So there might be a formula they just couldn't grasp in class. They go back and review that. So if you haven't used lecture capture or you want to use the document camera, just ask us and we can help you with that, but do think about it. Also want to encourage you to provide support materials and resources to students. Information that would be so hard for them to find on their own. I mean, think about a freshman student coming into U of M, how overwhelming it is. We have so many resources for students. I'm sure you already know that, but helping them find it is going to be so useful. I mean, it's going to save them a lot of time. And if you could have a standard, you know, just some standard text that you put in all your syllabi, post in Canvas for all your courses, that's going to make a big difference. So some examples of what you might have. In LSA, we have a loan center that many people don't know about, faculty and students included, but students can check out equipment from cameras and camcorders to microphones, computers, and very often we have students whose computer just crashes and they need a new one, or they need more capacity to maybe do a media assignment, but they can go to the Loan Center. We also have Blue Core, which is a group of students who help other students with technology needs, just a variety of things. Maybe they're not good with Excel, or maybe they need to install a software and they're having trouble with that. That's available to students that they may not know about. Another example, the Ask a Librarian feature on the library website. As I said before, libraries are really hard to navigate for students. And if they are doing a research project, they may have questions you can't answer. Go to the Ask a Librarian, and if they can't answer it, and sometimes they can't, they can direct them to who can. Services for students with disabilities, and that's another thing that you should always put on your syllabi. At the end of the slides here, and I'm going to send these to you, we'll give you a link of links to many resources that you can use. And you know, some may be specific to your class. As I said, if you had a media assignment, then you probably definitely want to point out the Loan Center. So get that together, something that you can paste into all of your syllabi. And then I want to encourage you to post your slides and other support material before class to increase engagement during class. Now that definitely is counterintuitive to a lot of people. They don't like posting their slides ahead of time, but think about how that can benefit students to have your slides. And not just, like I said, not just students who might need an accommodation, but if a student might want to print them, maybe the student, English isn't their first language, and it helps them to print the slides and to write on them, especially now that a lot of you are teaching in Zoom. Allow them to do that, but you'll have to publish them before class. That's just a different way of thinking. So consider that. Maybe you're giving a lecture where you're using a lot of jargon. There's a lot of terms that students don't know. If you provide them a glossary with definitions or some references, they could print that, have it on the side. I mean, just think about how that frees the capacity in their brain, you know, reduces that cognitive load. They don't have to stress about figuring out what that word means if you provide them some of this before class. I have an example here of a study aid, you know, just to go into a little bit of detail, something that a lot of people are doing now. They're using guided lecture notes. And I think this is particularly helpful now that so many people are lecturing on Zoom. But guided lecture notes are instructor created handouts that really provide an outline for students to start taking their notes in. Again, this seems counterintuitive because we know that students learn a lot from writing, and they certainly do. But the research, and there is so much research on this, says that what happens when you create these for students is that it does reduce their cognitive load. They can actually engage more in what you're saying, pay attention to the class, hear you, because they're not trying to create this structure. Typically, they look like this because often they're used in the sciences. So there's some background information, the standard cues are there, and the space to write, you know, like I said, is typical because this is used often in science classes. So students might have space to, let's say, draw mitosis out. That's a good thing for them to do. But even if it's a, sociology class where maybe they don't have to draw, this can be really helpful. The way that they would use these and the way they typically use these in a lecture hall is they print these. Imagine how much this would help a student who is struggling with English too. They print them, they have them on the side, and then as you're lecturing, they go through and fill it in. It does increase their engagement and recall. And this, as I said, this is all research driven. And then at the end of the semester before exams, they have a really nifty study aid. So this is just an example of something that, like I said, this helps everybody, and it helps definitely those students that might be falling behind because they're having trouble taking notes. So do think about including something like this. And I have a question for Phil. I'll be honest, we really have struggled getting professors to post recordings of their lecture, Zoom recordings, or materials before class. So I wanted Phil to talk a little bit about why it's so important, because there really is a lot of resistance to this. Phil, can you talk about some of the benefits of posting materials for students before class, and then the value of posting videos?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think Terry touched on this a couple of slides ago, but posting materials ahead of time, while it can be controversial, it can be very helpful. As Terry also mentioned a couple of slides ago, students are strategic when you provide them with different pieces of content. They'll know how they can use that content to best meet their learning needs, and they will be able to, ahead of time, before they go to your class session, connect the materials that they've studied or looked at the night before with the materials that they're learning the day of. And that'll help them kind of follow along better and let them know too when they may need to ask for extra help on different sections. They may say you provide the slides ahead of time and the second example that you're going through is confusing to the student when they're looking at it the night before. They'll know to pay extra attention at that moment or potentially to raise some questions at that time. Um, I know that some instructors may resist this practice because they believe that it could reduce student attendance ahead of time. But I believe that posting before class means that students can more easily follow along with the class. I linked to Learn Before Lecture. It's an article that was published, I think, 2014, if I'm remembering correctly, which talks about how class time can be more focused on guided learning using those materials with more time to answer questions or more time for activities. I know this kind of treads towards like the flipped learning model, but it doesn't necessarily always need to be that way. Having the stuff ahead of time helps folks follow along. If you're just posting the exact stuff that you're going to go through, it'll help them know when they need to really hone in, pay attention most deeply, and when they might need to ask questions. It may also reduce the amount of time that you have to spend on extra office hours, because if you can go through and answer those questions in the moment, the day of, then students may have less of those technical questions, or it may reframe how you use your office hours. Maybe it's less about answering, how we managed to get from point A to point B on this second example, and maybe it's more about learning about the students' goals and what they want to do in the field. Um, I think there's a lot of ways that this can be beneficial, but really at the core, it supports different learning styles and it allows students to kind of know how they can best support themselves because everyone learns differently, and having those materials ahead of time will help students know when to ask those questions and when they may need some extra help.
And we're about at the midway point. Sean, Zeba, were there any questions in the Q&A that we can answer before we move on?
No, there was one little pointer. Terry, I think your mic might be too close to your mouth. It's
Okay.
causing a lot of pops. So
Okay,
otherwise, no, there's no questions.
thanks so much. Okay, I moved it away. So hopefully that's good. All right, so we'll move on to designing inclusive course content. Not so much your curriculum, but the content that you're bringing into your course, so that you can create an environment where all students feel reflected and valued. The first point here is thinking about asking the question, are you bringing in diverse ideas and perspectives? So this is the reflective part to ask yourself. For example, most courses have some current event component to them where you might bring in maybe an op-ed piece, an editorial, some article you're bringing in. Are you bringing in only pieces that you support that come from your perspective? For example, maybe you're very progressive politically. You might have a lot of students in your class who are conservative. And actually, I use that example because we've heard from a lot of conservative students that they don't feel like they have a voice in the class. The professors are always bringing in viewpoints that are very different and that they're afraid to speak up. They're afraid they may not be able to share what they believe. So that just ask you to reflect on that and bring in some pieces that maybe are different. Bring in something that you disagree with to make sure that you're getting a variety of perspectives. Just be mindful of that. And then try to select authors of that material that you're bringing in that are from diverse backgrounds. There's a lot of research in the social sciences that tells us when young people can't see themselves reflected in their career field, that they don't feel like they have a place there. So it can be really hard to find examples, but it's worthwhile to look and really to ask yourself about the authors that you're bringing in. Are you finding enough diversity there and bringing that in? And then when you are reading materials or viewing any type of videos, be sure to point out stereotypes. Talk about the stereotypes that you see and other shortcomings. For example, maybe you're reading a literature and they're using the universal he, only male pronouns. Talk about that. Let students know that you can recognize when there are stereotypes and that you can talk about that so that they feel like they're not a person who is seen through the stereotype lens. And then use multiple examples that speak across gender, culture, socioeconomic status. Make sure that you're doing that. So one of the things I've been reading a lot about, especially in the New York Times, is the social impact, the psychological impact of raising children in the COVID-19 era and how challenging that is. And a lot of the pieces that I'm reading really focus on women and how they're getting the brunt of the work and the job insecurity. And that's probably true statistically, but I can't tell you how many men I've met with over the last 7 months that have babies on their laps. So men are being impacted too. So just make sure that you really evaluate when you step back and look at your course. Are you bringing in that diversity? Are you really reflecting your world? Because it's easy to do. So be mindful of that. And then we can talk about allowing for multiple modes of assessment. Can you allow students to demonstrate their understanding in more than one way? So the place to start here is really thinking about what are the student learning outcomes? What is it that you want students to learn? What is a particular assessment assessing? And I just want to point out that we're not talking about changing learning goals. Your learning goals should stay the same. It's just the student mode of expression that can be different. As an example, let's say that in a writing course, students have a learning outcome where they will write with voice. They will use voice in their rhetoric. I'll say not necessarily write with voice, but they need to demonstrate that they can use voice in their arguments. Well, a good thing to do would be a piece of writing, then they can demonstrate voice, but maybe there's some other way that they can demonstrate how they apply voice to their argument. Maybe they can create a video, maybe they can have a debate. They can express it in different ways and you can evaluate how well they apply voice to their rhetoric in different ways, but you're not changing the learning outcome. You're still evaluating how well they can apply voice. So that's just something to think about. Be mindful of that. And can you create some flexibility? Think about a summative assessment is kind of the end game. At the end of the semester, you have a final exam or you have a major project. Summative means, it's at the end, there's not a lot of time to reteach or go back. So think about something that you give at the end of the semester that might be worth a lot of points. For example, many classes have a presentation requirement, and it's worth maybe 30% of the grade. But you may have a student that just panics at giving a presentation and maybe just struggles to do that. Or possibly they've mastered the content and they could have demonstrated their knowledge in a better way if you would have given them more options. So are you limiting those modes of expression? The activities that you do in class, I'll call them formative activities. These are the things that students do to practice their learning outcomes. This is how you're building their skills. Vary those, make sure you're not always using the same thing. So for example, remembering, understanding the lower level Bloom's things. Maybe you're doing iClicker, which is great for that, but not all students do well with multiple choice. Is there another activity you can bring in? Something like maybe Jeopardy or some think, pair, share. What about having students analyze the content? Are you giving them a variety of ways to demonstrate how well they can do that? Obviously, a piece of writing is great, but maybe they can work together to solve a problem. Maybe they can look at a case study, do some project in class where they're analyzing something, and you can assess how well they're able to do that. Or creating, maybe they are creating an argument and you want to see how well they're doing. Yeah, they could do a written outline, but maybe they could do something like a graphic organizer where you can take a look and see, check their progress and assess them in a different way. And maybe they're better at expressing that. So are you providing those options? And then as far as the in-class, those quick assessments that you do, which very often is, hey, raise your hand if you don't understand. I'm not always the one to do that. Some students will, but is there another way to get at that, to assess them? Maybe at the end of class, they do an exit ticket. It could be like a muddiest point now that we're working virtually. It could be a form that they fill out. Something that's not the same every class. Because if you're assessing students in exactly the same way each time, there may be a student that just that's not the right mode for them, and it may not be an accurate assessment. So put some variety in there. And then as often as you can, allow opportunities for students to choose their own topics of interest. And that can be even in an in-class assignment, an activity that you're doing. Maybe there's 5 groups with 5 different topics, and let students self-select. Anytime they can select a topic that they're working on, that's really going to help them invest and feel really part of the class. If you can ask them to draw on their own experiences and cultural differences, again, they're just going to feel more invested, and it really gets at that individual learner. An example that I have is from a food and politics class where the instructor wanted students to really understand the diversity of ideas around food and politics. And she asked students they had all these different characters that the class can look at and analyze just to see different perspectives and value students and understand that everybody's coming from somewhere different. Student learning outcomes. So I have an example that we'll talk about in detail. So this is from a women's studies class, and the students, we're going to be working with the student learning outcomes. Students will investigate how women's power and gender equality have evolved in America. So how do they do that? So underneath we have these bullets here. These are what we call enabling objectives, where this is how you get there. So how do they investigate? Well, these are the things that they can do that build their capacity. So this is one of the student learning outcomes for the course. And at the end of the course, students are going to have a final project, which is really typical. It's typically a writing assignment, but it's a project in which they're going to demonstrate their understanding of how women's power and gender equality have evolved in America. All right, so think about giving students this question at the beginning of the semester and think about what they could do with it before the course. They could probably have some superficial knowledge. They might be able to create something or give you a piece of writing that's pretty superficial. Now think of what they can do at the end of the course. Now they have political context, historical context. They've heard stories and they know about legal events that have happened, and they've just had these discussions in class. So now their understanding is far deeper. And you wanted them to articulate their ideas, to be able to take a position, to be able to talk about it comprehensively. And that's not something that's best measured in a multiple choice exam. So they need to do a project. And very typically, it's a research paper, which is wonderful, right? Research papers are great, but not every student can fit into that mold. Not every student can thrive with a research paper. And is it going to be the best assessment for everybody? Now, think about it. Does it have to be a piece of writing? What if you gave them some options? So, as an example, let's say you offered them a podcast assignment. They could do the same thing, right? They can still take a position. They can still have an argument. They can still use rhetorical strategies. They can write. They can talk with voice. They can do those same things and express it maybe far better than they could in a piece of writing for some students. So think about, does this assignment have to be a writing assignment? Can you give students some options to do the same thing? So we're not changing the student learning outcomes here. If this is the student learning outcome, then this is what you're after, right? Not necessarily a piece of writing. Now, if the learning outcome were something like students will write within the conventions of the field, or they will use APA format, then yes, it has to be a piece of writing. You don't change that. So keeping the student learning outcomes the same, can you give them some more possibilities, some options to demonstrate how well they understand the content? But I will add that I'm not suggesting that they have unlimited opportunities, that you just say, hey, go out there, create, do something great. And we've seen that. And that is not fair to students. They really need specific assignment criteria. So not unlimited options, but you give them some options that would be most appropriate. So maybe there's 3 options in which, let's say it's a podcast or a writing assignment. They need criteria for both. They need assignment sheets and rubrics, and they need those parameters. It doesn't mean you can't work with a student who maybe wants to do something a little bit different, but think about those final projects. Is there a way you can give students more opportunity to demonstrate their learning? And because so often, and probably most classes, there is a major writing assignment, Phil's going to talk a little bit about the writing assignment and how can you make a writing assignment more inclusive?
Yeah, thanks, Terry. And I'm going to go through a couple of points here that Terry and I talked about. So avoiding narrow topics. I think that as you let students write about things that they're passionate about, or as you let them bring in different um, skills that they're passionate about and let them flex their creativity, they're going to be more engaged. Also, if you're having narrow topics, it could be difficult for some students to apply their experiences to answering the topic that you've provided. Uh, Sean and Terry have both talked a lot about using rubrics. There's really no better way to set expectations. I really encourage that. And if you're in a department with a bunch of other folks and you're struggling to make your own rubrics, you can always touch base and see if others have rubrics that they use. Offering examples, if you can work with students that have done a good job in the past on an assignment in your class and see if they would be okay with you sharing some of that work in whatever manner. That could be a really great way to show how to meet, a writing assignment, especially for first gen students. It can be really helpful to just have an example of what you're looking for. If it's the first time you're doing that assignment, you could provide an example yourself. Terry mentioned offering multimodal options. Sometimes the goal of the writing assignment isn't, the grammar, the style, the APA style, things like that. And I think that that's a really great way to, again, encourage that creativity and get people to work with a medium that they understand. Another thing I like doing is asking for kind of just like a cover letter. The way I think about this is it's the email that you send to your boss when you're turning in your deliverable that they've asked you for. It just gives the students the opportunity to reflect on what they've done, why they did it, and how they did it. Um, and it allows for them to kind of contextualize the assignment that they're turning into you. It makes it easier for you as an instructor to grade for effort, and it also helps you understand their process and really, what went into the making of that assignment. And talking about the weight of how you grade, I think is really important. Some writing instructors, for example, really value, for example, grammar, whereas others may be more looking for style and sentence variety, and just making statements about that. I value grammar very strongly in my grading and in my writing, and here's the style guide that I use to grade for that. I think can be a really great way to set those expectations of students and help them meet those expectations. Back to you, Terry.
Okay. So the last approach that I want you to think about is asking yourself, are you using a variety of student engagement techniques? I'll call those, that's what we usually call them for short. So these are just designed, these are activities that are designed to help you create activities for students. So one of the ways they're compared to is a recipe, and that it's like a template. They're already created. The process is there. You just put in your own material. So for example, think, pair, share is the example of a student engagement technique. The process is already there. So first you give everyone an opportunity to think, and then students pair together and talk about the topic, and then somebody shares out. And you might use that in your class maybe to activate prior knowledge. You might have a different reason to use it, but you know the formula, it's there. So you don't have to, reinvent the wheel. These activities are already created. And at the end here, I'm going to give you some books that have just tons of these activities. So you don't have to spend your time thinking about an activity. There's one already designed for you. You just, plug in your own information. So really think about how much of a variety are you using in your class? You probably use techniques to engage students in knowledge, like lower level skills. So for example, maybe you're using iClicker in class, or you're doing surveys. You're probably using student engagement techniques to develop critical thinking skills in your students. Maybe they're working together, they're working on case studies, or they're doing a debate. That might be kind of familiar to you. But what I want to encourage you to do today is to try something different, to think about integrating some student engagement techniques that help students develop attitudes, values, and learning and study skills. And this we don't see as often. And this is really done within the context of your own course, your own curriculum. You're not just talking randomly about attitudes and values, but you're integrating it with your course. So I'm going to give you some examples here. I have 3 examples that I think work well because they can translate into any course. And one thing you can do is an autobiographical reflection, where students think about their beliefs and biases in relation to course content. For example, a math professor asked students to write a piece about one of the most profound experiences they've had in math class. Maybe that's good, maybe that's bad. And what do you find out from that? The biases a student might have. Student may feel, I'm not good at math. I can't do it. I can only go to a certain point. I'll never get past it, which of course isn't true. So it'd be helpful to, let students know that, and to at least know what they're thinking. Maybe they can express certain learning problems that they've had, but having them reflect on the way that they're going to connect to that course. Another set could be an ethical dilemma. And these are great for students because not only are they forced to think about their own values in a way maybe they haven't before, but they also get to see how that relates to the values of other students. As an example, a statistics class is given a scenario in which they work for a pharmaceutical company who's trying to get out this vaccine to fight a pandemic. It's really important that this vaccine gets out there. Maybe it's not quite there. So they're given the data and told, make this work? Well, they get to talk to each other about who would fudge and how much would you fudge on this, and really think about their ethics in relation to the course, because maybe they haven't thought that before, and also get to experience what other students are thinking. So ethical dilemma. Another technique for more learning and study skills, a circular response. This is helps students develop listening skills. So let's say a poli-sci class is looking at the effects of social media on politics or on voting. The way this works is the first person gets talking, but then the next person has to summarize the previous person's statements and then use that as a springboard to talk. So that means they have to listen. Everybody has to listen, and that's a skill that many people don't have. So it really helps them develop that personal study skill, learning skill. So try that. And then just a caveat, don't use a ton of different activities. Don't get one of these books and every day you're doing something that's complicated, because that will frustrate students. But try a few of them that you think will work well with your class. And just, take a moment and think about how diverse and inclusive are the sets that you're using in your class. As an example, probably the most common teaching practice is classroom discussions. Are you using those every day? Is that the only way students are interacting with each other? Because if it is, think about how inclusive that is. What students really thrive in that environment and what don't? Who doesn't? And is that the only thing that you're offering students? So think about that. I have an example to talk about. And that has to do with discussion. It's a brainstorming procedure, which is often part of your discussion. Not every discussion includes brainstorming, but many do. And I know it's just a technique that a lot of people use. So I want to talk about actually a procedure. It's called brainstorming procedure, because I think it exemplifies inclusive teaching, and it was designed for inclusion. It actually doesn't come out of education. It comes from the marketing field. And I think it dates back to the 1940s, where a marketing executive noticed that his team just wasn't getting results, that their brainstorming wasn't inclusive. It was kind of getting the voice of one person. Not everyone was participating. People were shutting down, wasn't getting creativity. So he designed this inclusive process that I'm going to walk you through, because I think many principles here you can directly apply with this process, or you can apply it to your other sets that you're doing. So the first thing is provide a structured guided prompt. This is so important, and we've heard from a lot of students that when they're in their Zoom sessions and they're sent to breakout rooms, they're just told to have a discussion, but that kind of seems like busy work to them. They don't really know what they're supposed to be doing, and they need a little more guide. So start with having that structured prompt. And then key is that everybody gets time to think and write before anybody speaks. Just think about what happens if you just threw out a question to your class. Often it's the same students that respond. And then other students, their minds just kind of stop. They were going in a different direction, but they just stopped. That keeps you from getting a diversity of ideas. And you tend to hear like the student that's rising to the top, their ideas tend to get out, not necessarily the best ideas. So everybody gets time to write and think. And then roles are assigned, whether brainstorming or just discussion. So somebody can be a leader and lead the discussion. Someone can record and take notes. And then someone will be responsible for presenting or articulating those ideas to the larger audience. The hard part is that you don't evaluate while ideas are being created. And this is hard. I know when I was teaching and I would give my student this brainstorming process, you can hear them say things like, no, that's not a good idea. That won't work. And you have to just keep reminding them, no, don't evaluate ideas right now, because that stifles creativity and that keeps all students from being included. Let people think out loud a little bit, maybe clarify those ideas, but don't evaluate at this point. And then another key is that the ideas need to be displayed so everyone sees them. And I think about in maybe a work setting or even in class, we use the big sticky notes and somebody's puts it on the wall and is writing on it. That way everybody can see it. Today, it might be a Google Doc. You know, if your students are working remotely, it's definitely probably going to be a Google Doc, but everybody needs to see the ideas, not a name connected to it, but just the ideas. And then when everybody gets that out, then you engage in the critical evaluation and selection of ideas. And this is where you do have to evaluate. So have to use some critical evaluation, but the names aren't necessarily tied to the ideas. So people don't feel attacked or like their idea is being criticized. And then, you know, change up the groups frequently that you're using in class. So this brainstorming procedure is an inclusive approach. So I think about how you might apply some of these principles to the other sets that you're using. Well, and then just to sum up again, as I said, inclusive teaching isn't about being prescriptive. It's not a set of rules. It's really just thinking about your teaching practices, asking the question, am I being inclusive and who might I be excluding? And so the 4 ways that we're asking you to think about that is the way that you're interacting with students, by varying the content that you bring in and allowing students to demonstrate their understanding in different ways, and then really bringing in a broader variety of student engagement techniques into your course. I have some reading recommendations that really great books. And if I had to recommend one here, I would pick out this dynamic lecturing because it talks about the psychology and research behind creating an inclusive environment for your students. There's other books here like the assessment techniques and student engagement techniques that have those sets already designed for you. So I think you'll find this a great resource. And then we have some links to resources for the University of Michigan. And these are the resources that you might want to place on your syllabus. I'll end by leaving the slide up of the ways that you can contact us. And again, just let you know that we will be following up with a link to this recording and the slides and a few other resources.